Good evening. We're ready to get started. Maseches Pesachim Daf Chav Gimel. We are beginning at the bottom of Chav Beis Mid Beis, 9 lines from the bottom, starting with the words V'harei Orla, the sugya of Orla, which is the isser of eating fruits from a tree for the first few years of a tree. Now, before we get into what this sugya is talking about, let's go back to yesterday's conversation. We've been discussing the isser hana, the general status of isser hana as it relates to an isser achila. And the chakira that we've been discussing, and we will, Baruch Hashem, conclude this sugya today, at the end of today, about 15 lines or so from the bottom of Chav Gimel Amid Beis. The chakira that we've had is whether or not we hold like the world, the camp of Chizkiah, that when the Torah says that there's an isser achila, it is not automatic that there's an isser hana. It's not necessarily the case that you're not allowed to sell and or benefit from that food that you're not allowed to eat. Versus Rabbi Abba, who is of the opinion that these two things always happen in tandem. And in both cases, it's not that the halacha is going to result necessarily differently. They may agree, but the method to how they get to the result may be a difference. So that's going to be their chakira. And again, we're going to start asking a question on Rabbi Abba. Let's get started. 9 lines from the bottom, Daf Chav Beis Mid Beis. Rabbi Abba was of the opinion that the isser, the oraisa of achila, in this case of orla, should be automatically accompanied by nisr hana. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, "V'harei orla derachmana amar." The Torah says in regards to orla, what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, "Arelim lo ye'achel." It should not be eaten. These fruits should not be eaten. V'tanya. What does the brisa say on this pasuk? The pasuk says, "Arelim lo ye'achel." Ainli ela isser achila. I only have from the pasuk. All I know is that you're not allowed to eat the fruits that are in orla. Minayin shelo yehanemi menu. How do I know that you are not supposed to get hana from them as well? Shelo yitzavabo, that you shouldn't take whatever is growing that from an orla tree and use it as a dye, use it as something to soak in water to extract the dye, or velo yadlik boas haner, or to extract something that may be used for lighting a candle. How do I know that that's not allowed? Talmud Lomar, because the pasuk says it has multiple uses of the word arel, with that shoresh, va'araltem, or laso arelim lo yeachel lerabos eskulam. So basically, we have a brisa. The brisa says, yes, I see the pasuk. The pasuk is an isser achila. How do we know that there's an isser hana? It's from the triple use of the word arel in the pasuk of va'araltem or laso and arelim, that there's an isser hana. First of the long lines of Chav Beis Mid Beis, and here's where the Gemara is going to pose its question. Taima, what's the reason why we have an Isser Hana? How do we know? Because it's the Kasav Rachmana V'aral Tem or Laso Arelim, because the Torah used these extra words, and the Brisa says these extra words were to teach you an Isser Hana. Halav hachi, without having these extra words in the pasuk, hava amina. What would I have thought without these extra words? Hava amina, I would have thought isra achila mashma, isra hana lo mashma. I might have thought that there is an isra achila, but that there's no isra hana. And this would go against Rabbi Abba, because Rabbi Abba was of the opinion that whenever there's an isra achila, it's automatically accompanied by an isra hana. So why then here by orla does the pasuk say that you cannot eat it, and then the Brisa adds, by the way, there's no Isser Hana? What's with the by the way? Rabbi Abba, you hold that they always happen together. So why here by orla is it different? Says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom, Lo olam, lo yeachel mashma. Really what the pasuk means is, Bein Isser Achila, Bein Isser Hana. Really, it is true that that's what the pasuk means. But here, the reason why the Torah had to go out of its way to remind us that we have an Isser Hana is because the shiny hasam in the case of Orla, that case is different. D'chsiv lachem. There the pasuk has the word lachem. And what does the word lachem do? It introduces a suffix. What's the concern? I need to have this brisa to teach me there's an Isser Hana by Orla. Because sal kadaita chamina. I might have thought, Hoil v'kasav lachem shelachem yehei. I might have thought that since in the pasuk of Orla, by the isser of eating the fruits of a tree within its first 3 years, I might have thought lachem shelachem yehei, that you are allowed to benefit from it. Kamash malan, I add in the words v'araltem and Orla. So I add in all these words to remind me that there's an isser hana. So that's what the Gemara says. Good to go, right? That was Rabbi Abba. You said everything comes together. Orla, we see that they don't all come together. We needed a drasha to say that there was an Isser Hana. Answers the Gemara. Now, just here we needed it because it had the word lachem. Says the Gemara, if the word lachem is bothering you, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu put it there? If your whole thing is that, no, the pasuk says don't eat Orla. The Isser Hana is learned from the triple usage of the word Arel in the pasuk. Why do we need that? Because of the word lachem. So it says the Gemara, ve'ela hasad d'ksivi hanach kroi. Once we have these usage of the word arel 3 times in the pasuk, once I have that triplicate use, lachem lamali. I don't understand. Why is it so important to you that you have the word lachem? So answers the Gemara, a brisa, and this brisa is why we need the word lachem. Lechem. The word lachem in the pasuk is to teach me the following. Lachem, when the pasuk by Orla says lachem, it is lerabos, to include in the iser hana'ah, the iser of as hanatua lerabim, a tree that's planted for the rabim. Machlokes Rashi Tosfos here. Rashi dibur hamaskil lerabim litzorech rabim kigon be'emtza derech lechol over, a very very public space. Tosfos writes at the top natua lerabim b'rshus hayachid litzorech rabim v'lo k'mo shepir shekuntrus be'emtza derech. All right, okay, just a machlokes in the Metzias as to what this case actually is. So that's the Tana Kama, is that the reason why we have the word lachem is to include another aspect into the Isser of Orla. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lahotzi, to exclude something, lahotzi as hanatua l'rabim, to exclude that tree from this Isser. Okay, so now we understand, before we dig into this Bryce and understanding the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda, but now we understand a little bit more the Shita of Rabbi Abba. How did we start out? Rabbi Abba, we don't understand your Shita. You said that the Isra Achila and Isra Hana come together. Yet by Orla, we have a specific brisa to teach us about the Isra Hana, which means that they don't come together. Says Rabbi Abba, not really, they do come together, but the pasuk by Orla has the word lachem, so therefore I had to just make sure we know. So there's a brisa that says that therefore you know that there is going to be an Isra Hana. Says why the word lachem? Says we needed the word lachem according to the Tana Kama to make sure that we need to include, or according to the Rabbi Yehuda, to exclude something from the world of Orla. Now let's analyze the brisa. 2 lines from the top. Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. My time of the Tana Kama. Why does the Tana Kama say that it is the case that it is to include this tree that's being used for the public? Says the Gemara. My time of the Tana Kama dichsiv, because it is written in the Torah unetatem, that you should plant, and that does not seem like a word for the masses. Liyachid mashma. It's a plural word. How does that liyachid mashma? Take a look at Rashi. Unatatem liyachid mashma. The first line of Rashi. Dibur hamaskil unatatem liyachid mashma. Rashi writes, the ein derech rabim lin toa. You don't get 12 people together to plant a tree. It's a language that's being used for the individual that they should know that they should plant. Fine, that's his svara, the rabim lo mashma, and therefore, because it's not mashma for the rabim, where we were afraid that if there was a tree that was planted by the public, maybe we would have had an error, and therefore, kasav rachman alachem lahavi yisanatu the rabim. We had to make sure that we included this in the Isser of Orla. Fine, that's the Tana Kama. Rabbi Yehuda unatate mashma bein l'rabim bein liyachid. He holds that no, the word unatatem could also be understood for the individuals and for the masses. V'lachem bein yachid bein rabim mashma. And we have 2 exclusionary comments. We have the word unatatem that includes everyone, and we have the word lachem that seems to imply bein yachid bein l'rabim. So here is where we enter a Shas concept. Have a ribui achar ribui. Here we have a double exclusion in the same verse. We have the word unatatem, and then we have the word lachem. It what? Include. Have a ribui achar ribui, a double inclusion. You're correct. Bein ribui achar ribui elo lema'it. That's why I made the mistake, because of the end of the line. Because your double inclusion is an exclusion. Thank you, Vlad. That's a perfect correction. And that's what the Gemara means here, is that we are now excluding whenever you have a double inclusion. We usually use this in English in the opposite way. When you have a double negative, it's a positive. A double positive is usually not a negative. But here the Gemara says it's ribui achar ribui. The Gemara is trying to teach you something. Is that the Torah is trying to teach you something, and therefore that's how Rabbi Yehuda comes out in the negative to exclude this tree that's being used for the public from the world of Orla. That is the end of Sugya 1. We said, what about Orla? Rabbi Abba said, don't worry. The reason why in the world of Orla we needed the Psukim to include what should have been obvious for Rabbi Abba. I shouldn't have even needed a brisa. It says here we needed a brisa to include the Yisr Hana because it says the word lachem, and the word lachem was to include or to exclude machlokes Tana Kama Rabbi Yehuda about whether or not we're going to include this tree that is not to other rabbin. Sugya number 1 for today. What's that? No. Yeah. That's what he said. Yeah, exactly right. That's what if you look at it on the 3rd line, that's really where it's more of an indicator. That's exclusionary. We're kicking somebody out. But the way Rabbi Yehuda uses it is that it's bein yachid bein l'rabim. So he says an inclusionary phrase. The next sugya for tonight to analyze Rabbi Abahu, his shita, that both the Isser Achil and Isser Hana come together, is from the world of Truma. A regular person, a non-Kohen, is not allowed to eat, that we know. And then Vitznan, what does the Brisa say? that when it comes to truma, me'arvin lenazir beyayin, that's part of the Mishnah. We'll analyze that in a couple of minutes, but not yet. But what does the end of that Mishnah say? Uli Yisrael betruma. For those of you who loved Eruvin, this is a fond memory. For those of you who didn't, it's a little PTSD. But the Gemara here says that a person who's Stama Yisrael can make an Eruv with truma, but he's not allowed to eat it. It's truma, Isser Hana. So the Brisa, the Mishnah from Eruvin teaches us that there's no Isser Hana by truma. What happened, Rabbi Abo? Your rule is not being followed. You said whenever there's an Isser Achila, there's an Isser Hana. I'm a Yisrael. I can't eat that food. Should be an Isser Hana also. Why can I make an Eruv with truma? Says the Gemara, how would Rabbi Abo answer this question? Amar Rav Papa, Shani Hasam Damar Kra Trumaschem. There, the word was used Trumaschem, and I was concerned that you might have assumed. Not I was concerned. In fact, it's actually the case. Trumaschem. What does the pasuk mean? That we have an exception to the rule here. Here, there is no Isser Hana when it comes to Truma Shalachem Tehei. Good, that's fine. Now, what about Chizkiah in this case? V'idach, what would the other Shita say? Chizkiah, how do you look at this drasha? Because Chizkiah would say that the pasuk alone says that it's mutter, because what does Chizkiah say? The Isser Achila and the Isser Hana are always separate. So if the pasuk says you can't eat truma, great. Then of course that there's no Isser Hana because we never connect the two. So then what is this drasha? Because this drasha excludes it from the Isser Hana. But Chizkiah doesn't need that because Chizkiah doesn't hold that there's an Isser Hana from the start. So he says you're making a drasha on words that you don't need to make a drasha from. The Idach, how would Chizkiah answer? Trumaschem, Dechol Yisrael Kamar, just a loose reference, Trumaschem, that it refers to all of the Jews who are non-Kohanim. And that's what Rashi here indicates by the word Trumaschem, Dechol Yisrael Kamar, just to the right. Ve'orchei dekra li'ishta'uye hachi, just talking Yisrael lav dafka, dahabelavim ksiv. It's a loose language. It's not a language to make a diuk from, and that's how Chizkiah would learn it. That was sugya number 2 for the night. So now we've done the sugya of Orla, and we've done the sugya of Truma. Let's learn the sugya of Nazir. V'harei Nazir derachmana amar mecharsan v'adzag lo yachil. We know that when a Nazir is mekabel on himself to be a Nazir, a person should be careful to never say the phrase of I am and then finish it by saying that person is a Nazir. Do not say that in public with Ne'edim. It's very easy to accidentally take on the status of a Nazir, in which case you need Hataras Nadarim. Even today, Naziris is, it's just a nether like any other. It's just a nether like anything else. When I was in high school, 2 kids in my class said, and they just finished a sentence, and the Rabbi just put his hand on his face. We went to the base medrash. We did a Taras Adarm with the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, Rabbi Shlomo Morgenstern. And then right when we got back to class, another kid did it just to be a kanai, just to annoy everybody. It's a fair comparison considering who I'm thinking of. We can discuss later. So what about the Nazir? We know that a Nazir, once a person's begeder Nazir, they can't get a haircut. We know that they also cannot benefit from any aspects of a grape. Any of the components of a grape, you're not allowed to eat. It's non. What do we see? We saw in the Mishnah, just quoted a few lines ago, Me'arvin le-Nazir b'yayin. But a Nazir, when he's making an Eruv, he can use yayin. But the Nazir has an Isra Achila of the yayin. So if you're Rabbi Abahu, so I don't understand. If you have an Isra Achila, you should have an Isra Hana automatically. So what does it mean in the Mishnayos and Maseches Eruvin that a Nazir is allowed to make an Eruv with Yayin? It should be an Isra Hana too, and you're getting Hana by making an Eruv. So says the Gemara, 2 answers. We'll accept the first and reject the second. Amar Mar Zutra, Shiny Hasam da Amar Kra, Nizro, Shelo Yehe. It should be his. And in fact, we paskin this way. Rabbi Abahu's rule is still kept. This is the exception because we have a drasha that specifically excludes Nazir from the camp of Isser Hana. And therefore, in this case, by a Nazir, Afal Pi, even though it's true there's an Isser Achila, but there's no Isser Hana. Doesn't break the rules of Rabbi Abahu. Normally it's true. Here we have an exception, and we have a drasha to boot. Rav Ashi Amri says, no, maybe it's a little different. Rav Ashi says, maybe right, the reason why a Nazir doesn't have to be in this category of concern and why we shouldn't be asking the question in the first place about whether or not there's an Isra Hana by Nazir, Rav Ashi Amar, Kadosh Yeh Gadol Pera Se'ar Rosho. Is that right? I feel like I'm reading one of the words wrong. It says, Gadel Pera Se'ar Rosho. Kadosh Yeh Gadel Pera Se'ar Rosho. That's what the pasuk says, that he's going to be sanctified and he's going to grow out his hair. Gidulo Kadosh, his hair is Kadosh. Ve'ein Davar Acher Kadosh, but nothing else. The wine has no element of Kedusha. So maybe we should have a Havamina that there's no Isser Hana on the wine because it's not part of the Kadosh aspects of being a Nazir. Says the Gemara, Midi Ve'ein Davar Acher Ksiv. How are you being so exclusionary that that's the only thing that's Kadosh? And in light of this question, the Gemara says, you're right, Ela Machavarta. Rather, you were correct before. We're going back. Kidam Mar Zutra. We accept Mar Zutra's response, and Mar Zutra's response was that the reason why there's no Isra Hana by Nazir is because of a drasha Yisro Shelo Yehe. It should be considered his, and therefore by Nazir Halacha Lemaisa, there's no Isra Hana by Nazir L'chol Hadeus. According to even Rabbi Abba, who would say the Isra Hana and Isra Achila come together, doesn't apply by Nazir. Good. Fourth sugya, the Hare Chadash, the Isra of Chadash. We know that before the Korban Omer is brought on the second day of Pesach, on the 16th of Nisan, that the grains that have been grown that year are not allowed to be eaten. Okay, so that's the Isra of Achila. You're not allowed to eat it before that time. The Mishnah writes, you're allowed to use Chadash to feed animals. What does that show you? That there's no Isra Hana. Rabbi Abahu, again, come on. Well, every sugya in Shas is against you. What's going on here? So the Gemara says here as well, it doesn't make any sense. There's a drasha that says we've excluded the world of Chadash from Isra Hana, but otherwise Rabbi Abba's rule stands. Normally the rule stands, it just doesn't apply here. Why doesn't it apply here? Because we have an exclusionary drasha. Okay, well, if we have an exclusionary drasha, then Chizkiah, who doesn't need the drasha, because naturally Chizkiah would be of the opinion that there's no Isra Hana, because naturally Chizkiah always parses the Isra Achila from the Isra Hana. Well, then how does Chizkiah view this drasha? What's the point of this drasha? According to Chizkiah, there's no need. He doesn't need an exemption because Chizkiah from the beginning holds that the Isra Achila and Isra Hana are totally separated. He would have said there's no Isra Hana here from the beginning. So what does he do with Kitzir Chem? The Idach, what does Chizkiah say? Halfway down, almost halfway down, Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, says the Gemara, V'idach Kitzir Chem dekol Yisrael b'mashma. Just a general terminology similar to the one before. This is also Rashi, just how we're right. Kitzir Chem dekol Yisrael ka'amar v'orchei dekra le'ishta'uei hachi. Just the way that the Torah is talking, but nothing to make a drasha from. Next, another fifth sugya of the day. What about shratzim? How does this apply to Rabbi Abba? Shratzim, when it comes to rodents and small animals, you're not allowed to eat these animals. Vitznan, we have a Mishnah. You have a person who traps chaya, small animals, ophos, birds, vidagim, and fish. And shenizdamnu lahem, while they were trapping them, bain lebain, he also collected minim tmeim. He also picked up squirrels, whatever the rats, whatever they are, animals that are not kosher. So the halacha is mutar and l'mocher and l'nachrim. But if you're Rabbi Abba, why is that mutar? Same question over and over again. Why is that mutar if you're Rabbi Abba? If you hold that the Isra Achila and the Isra Hana are held together, so why here is it mutar be'hana by the sheret? Why are you allowed to sell the sheret? It should be asur be'hana. Says the Gemara, same model as before, halfway down, shani hasam damakar lachem. The reason why is because we have a drasha that excludes the world of sheretz from the Isra Hana. So again, Rabbi Abba, his rule still stands. When there's an Isra Achila, there's also an Isra Hana, unless there's a reason to exclude. And here we have a drasha specifically to exclude from the world of Isra Hana. Says the Gemara, Ihachi, if it's true that you can benefit from shratzim, afilu lechatchila nami, maybe you should be able to trap them as game from the start and sell them. We know from the Gemaras in Bava Kama that that's not right. We're not supposed to sell non-kosher animals, not a pasha to sugya with, again, owning stock, and you got to get into the sugya of all of those kinds of things. Can you own a company that sells animals that are mamish treif? Can you own a camel company, a pig company? Can you own a company where the animals are kosher but not shechted, right? These are all discussions to have. We know, but by nevela, we learned that was our starting sugya on the bottom of, where were we? On the bottom of Chafal from Beis Yadid, that nevela is an exception. There's no Isra Hana by nevela. That was what the pasuk said, that you can give it to a ger and sell it to a goy. Fine, no Isra Hana there, but by other animals, there's a real shaila. Rashi here speaks about this, that it says that you made you're a trapper. That's what the Mishnah says that we're learning here. And the language of the Mishnah was shenizdamnu lahem, that you happened upon these animals. Take a look at Rashi. Dibur hamaschel shenizdamnu, halfway down on the page. Dafka shenizdamnu, to lo matzrechinan lehu. They're really not for you. You're really not supposed to chase after them and collect these animals. Kiditznan, like the Mishnah writes, Hasan b'Maseches Shvius, ein osin schora, lo b'nevelos, v'trefos, lo b'shkatzin v'rabas. You should not. These are not the right places to have. They missed that in Isser Deraisa because we know that there's no Isser Hana by nevela, but it's not appropriate. Fine. So it says the Gemara, maybe we should run a business like this. Says the Gemara, that's not right. Shani hacha. The Amar Kra Yehu Behaviyasan Yehu. What does it mean, Yehu? So the pasuk here When it says the word Yehu, I'll read the pasuk. It says, "V'sheketz Yehu lachem." It should be to you sheketz. It's not appropriate. It's not right to run your business this way. You should not be selling those animals. Now, Ulechizkia, same questions as before. Ulechizkia, lamali lemechtav lo ye'achel, umaisi lachem lemishria. Now, this is a subtlety. I didn't say this yesterday, but it would have been helpful to do so. Yesterday, when we were, even 2 days ago, when we first learned Chizkia, he said that there is a place where we have an Isser Hana, and that's by Pesach. What was the language he used? Lo ye'achel. So there, the language of ye'achel, specifically, not lo sochlu and not yochal, ye'achel, that word, when Chizkiah uses that word, he agrees even with Rabbi Abba that word implies both Isser Hana and Isser Achila. So here the Gemara said it. Here the Gemara said lo ye'achel by Asheretz, but then it got exempted. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. If you're saying that the lo yachel implies also an Isser Hana, even for you, Chizkiah, why say anything? Why did the Torah have to say that and the word lachem? If you leave them both out, then we'll know exactly how you hold. You would have held that there was no Isser Hana here because the word lo yachel wouldn't have been present. Answers the Gemara. It says the Gemara to finish off its question. Lo lichtov rachmana lo yeachel, lo bay lachem. Had the Torah not said the words lo yeachel, we would not have then needed the word of lachem. Amar lach Chizkiah, how would he have answered? Taima didi nami mehacha. These words are a code. In other words, it's basically saying this is a beautiful proof for my idea that when it says the word yeachel, the only exemption is when you have some type of word to exempt you. This he's saying is like a paradigm. What we would say in halacha is like a binyan av. A binyan av is an area where we look at one snapshot in halacha, one area, and we apply it to other places. We say that women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs as it relates to tefillin, and we have a binyan av, it applies to other places. So what Chizkiah is saying is that this is a great example, says Chizkiah, of my shita, that when there's the word yeachel, it implies both Isser Achila and Isser Hana. Let's talk about another case. Chametz. It's our seventh halacha. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think 6 case. Says the Gemara 2/3 of the way down. Chametz. The Rachmana Amar lo yeachel chametz. The Torah says you can't eat chametz. Vitanya. What does the Brisa write? This is a very unique shita that we don't hold. Like Rabbi Yossi holds that there's no Isser Hana by chametz. Unbelievable thing because we're so makbid. What?
Why is it more going back to chametz now? Since we started.
Well, you'll see in a little bit. It's it's not so clear actually. Hold on 1 second.
That's how we started on the question of Isser Hana and Isser Achila. We're trying to prove what will be the din by chametz based upon all of these.
No, but first of all, it doesn't agree because Chizkiah started out by saying Minayin lechametz bePesach shu aser behana'a, and here it's Rabbi Yossi Aglili who's on the flip side.
It's weird that
it's a little strange. But let's finish the Mishnah and see if it clicks afterwards because it might. I don't have the answer to your question. It's a great point. David was just asking why here in the 2/3 of the way down in Chav Gimel are we going back to chametz? That's where Chizkiah started on Chav Aleph Amud Beis with this exact pasuk. So let's see if we can figure out an answer to that as we move through this. The Torah says you're not allowed to eat chametz. Vitanya, the Brisa writes the unique sheet of Rabbi Yossi Aglili who says Omer Tama al atzmacha hey chametz aser b'hana kol shiva. He holds that there's no iser of hana. So what do we see? Lo yachel chametz is an iser deraisa b'achila. Yet Rabbi Yossi holds that there's no Isser Hana. Says the Gemara, Shiny Hasam to Amar Krav, Lo Yerel Chas or Shalcha Yehe. Rabbi Yossi Haglili was of the opinion that yes, it's correct that now I understand the answer. Yes, it's correct that there is no Isser Hana here, but it's because of a pasuk. So there would just be a machlokas between Chizkiah and this Tana. Chizkiah would hold like the Rabbanan. The rabbis who hold that there is an Isser Hana, like Chizkiah does. How would he hold of that? Shalcha iyataroeh, aval ataroeh shel acherim shel gvo. This was a drasha we saw earlier in the parak. That what do we do with the pasuk? Rabbi Yossi Aglili uses this pasuk of v'lo yereh lecha seor. He uses it to say that there's no Isser Hana by chametz tzira Pesach. But we don't use the drasha that way. We use the drasha another way. We use the drasha to say that if I have your chametz in my house, then I don't violate the Isser by Rabbi Matzeh. I don't violate the Isser of ownership. So that's how the Rabbanan answer. The idach, what would Rabbi Yossi Aglili say? Where does he learn that from? Rabbi Yossi Aglili has to agree that if I have your chametz in my house, that I don't violate the Isser of ownership of chametz. So how would Rabbi Yossi Aglili learn that out? Idach trei lecha ksive. It says the word lecha multiple times in the pasuk, and he uses one of those lechas to make sure. One of them was for what he said that there's no Isser Hana by chametz, and the other one was to make sure he knew that if I have your chametz in my house, that I don't violate the Isser. Oh, the idach. Back to you, Rabbanan. Well, what do you do with the word lecha? Because you don't use it for that. You said that we learn that if I have your chametz in my house, that I don't violate the issur of ownership from lo yireh. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili learned from the word lecha. What do you do with the word lecha? So says the Gemara. The idach, 10 lines from the bottom. Chad benachri shekibashto v'chad benachri shelo kibashto. It's sugya we learned earlier in the Masechta. Basically, different statuses of a nachri as it relates to your relationship with them, and each lecha is for its own purpose to teach us a specific din that you do not violate ownership. The idach, where does Rabbi Yossi Haglili learn that out from? Tzalasa lecha ksivi. If you look over 2 psukim, you'll see the word lecha 3 times, and he says, I learned it out from the third one. The idach, back again to the Rabbanon. You need to I need this in my notes. I write, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbanan. I always, it's very confusing. How does the Rabbanan learn that out? There's different kinds of chametz, and we need each one. And I might have misunderstood one chametz for the other. Rashi here goes through a sophisticated explanation of why vitzriche. A bigger question is why it's not included in the Gemara. Normally, when we see the phrase vitzriche, it means that we have a list of things, usually 2 or 3 things, and then the Gemara says, if I didn't have A, then I would have made a mistake about B. And if I didn't have B, I would have mistake about C. And if I didn't have C, I would have mistake about A. But here the Gemara doesn't even include that. Rashi here includes it. Let's take a look at Rashi, 8 lines from the bottom, 3 lines into the wide lines. I might have thought the halacha by seor, which is a hard version of chametz, that would have been a different halacha. Val chametz ema mutter. I might have thought with chametz, which is more soft, it wouldn't have been a problem. Because of chametz, maybe I would have said something different about chametz, which is edible now. About seor, I might have thought you wouldn't have violated the issur. So they play with all these drashas, and that is how the Gemara concludes this sugya that chametz is not a problem for the shita of Rabbi Abba. His shita has stayed through approximately 10 different sugyas. Unbelievable. We will get to a conclusion today, hopefully at some point. So let's continue. Says the Gemara, Lema Kitanai. Maybe the machlokas between Chizkiya and Rabbi Abba is like the following machlokas tanaim. I'm going to tell you right now, hard to understand from this page, from the last 5-6 lines here, what the machlokas is. When we turn the page, we'll understand better what Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili are fighting about here in this case. What does the Brisa say? This is a pasuk in regards to chelev of a nevela. Ma Talmud lomar lekol malacha. What do I learn from the word lekol malacha? The plural, all, not plural, but the all-inclusive, the word kol. Sheyachol, maybe I would have thought sheyachol lemalechas gavo yehimuter. Maybe there would be no isser hana as it relates to the chelev of a nevela. Lemalechas hedyot yehei aser, and I might have thought that it would have been aser for a hedyot, for a regular person, only allowed in the mikdash. Talmud lomar lechol malacha. The word lechol teaches us that the isser, that the leniency of that the leniency applies everywhere, both by maleches hedyot and by maleches gavo. Rabbi Akiva, 3 lines from the bottom, Omer sheyachol lemaleches hedyot yehei tahor. He's not using the language that previously. What was Rabbi Yossi using as his language? He was saying mutter and aser, and here we see tahor b'tameh. Rabbi Akiva Omer sheyachol lemaleches hedyot yehei tahor, lemaleches gavo yehei tameh. Talmud lomar lechol malacha. So here he says we're not talking about aser and mutter. We're talking about tameh and tahor, very different topics in halacha. One is what is mutter, one is not. One is what is the status of that thing? Is it tameh? Can it cause tumah for other issues? So Rabbi Akiva says that this pasuk is talking about something totally different. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the tumah v'tara, he says, no, come on, Rabbi Akiva, you're talking about tumah v'tara, lo istrich kra. We don't need a pasuk for that. Ki istrich kra le'isr v'heter. We only need the pasuk to tell us about the isr hana. Rabbi Akiva pushes back. Rabbi Akiva isr v'heter lo tzarich kra. That I don't need. That's obvious to me. But ki istrich kra le'tumah v'tara. So now as we turn the page, we'll have more clarity onto how this links back. Remember the question we're asking is the machlokas between Chizkiya and Rabbi Abba linked possibly to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili? Isn't this what Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva are arguing about, such that we could connect it back to our machlokas between Rabbi Abba and Chizkiya? Top of Chav Gimel Amud Beis, the Rabbi Yossi Aglili savar lo sochlu mashma bein isra achila bein isra hana'a. It seems from Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who's speaking about Isser V'Heter, that the Isser applies across the board. So remember, he said that it applies both by Meleches Kodesh and by Meleches Hedyot. So what does that see? We see that the Isser Hana is everywhere. And the Heter that we saw in the Mishnah here is that there's no Isser Hana. Rabbi Akiva, and by the way, that's Rabbi Abahu through and through. Rabbi Akiva, he's like Chizkiah. What does he say? So Isser Achila mashma, Isser Hana lo mashma. That's beautiful. That's an exact language that we use by Chizkiah. So it seems from here that Rabbi Yossi Aglili is like the opinion of Rabbi Abahu, and Rabbi Akiva is like the opinion of Chizkiah. The Chiasa Kra Latuma Vitara. The pasuk's not even talking about Isser. Is not talking about Isser Beheder. It's not talking about Isser. No, it's talking about something unrelated about Tuma Vitara. Says the Gemara, can we make this comparison? Answers the Gemara, lo, we cannot. Dekule Alma. Everyone agrees. Lo Sochlu Mashma Bein Isser Achila Bein Isser Hana. Everyone agrees to Rabbi Abahu's approach when it comes to this Mishnah. The Hacha B'Haka Miflage, really here in this Mishnah that we use to try to prove a link between Chizkiah and Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva in this brisa, they're arguing about something totally different. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Savar Kisha Hutra Nevela He Hutra Chelba V'Gidala Hutra Hutru. That according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, when the Torah was matir to use a nevela for Hana'ah, it was only that, but not the chelev and not the gid, not the fats of the animal and not the gid hanashe, not the sciatic nerve. That's also not allowed. And the Torah was going to come along and be matir. Good, that's what he was talking about, but he wasn't talking about our sugya purely. He wasn't talking about whether or not he held like Chizkiah versus Rabbi Abahu. That was not what he was talking about. For Rabbi Akiva, 12 lines down, Rabbi Akiva savar kshutra nevela chelba v'gida nami hutru. The pasuk was already inclusive, like we saw on the previous blot. So the Gemara says the cases are not comparable, and therefore, in conclusion on this short piece, is that the machlokas between Chizkiah and Rabbi Abahu about whether or not the Isser Hana is automatically tethered to the Isser Achila, you cannot link that to the machlokas of Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. Anyways, it says the Gemara as a side point, Rabbi Yossi Aglili is very difficult to understand. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Ashkechan Chelev Desharya Rachmana Behana Elagid Nema de Aser. I understand. We have a case, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, where chelev is going to be permissible. Elagid nema de aser. You're going to say that there's an isser hana by the gid. So two answers here. 1/3 of the way down. Chav kimel amud beis yibais ema hachanami de aser. Some say you're actually right that actually has an isser hana. And yibais ema ma'isila bekal v'chomer. And some say that he learns out what he holds by gid anasha from a kal v'chomer. Here's the kal v'chomer. We're going to uproot this in a minute, but here's the kal v'chomer. Uma chelev she'anush kares. A person who eats chelev, it's one of the highest consequences we have in the Torah. Eating chelev is equivalent to a whole bunch of other things that are terrible in the Torah. Ayin krisus, the first Mishnah there. So ma chelev she'anush kares, but even there mutter behana. Even in a most extreme case, where you're not allowed to eat chelev, and if you do so, it's chayiv kares. There we say it's mutter behana. Then gid hanashe, then gid she'eno anush kares, then gid hanashe, the eating the sciatic nerve, which is a much lesser problem. There's no isser kares, lokol shekain. All the more so, it's going to be mutter behana. That's a beautiful argument. Says the Gemara, no. I could undo that argument very quickly. For Reb Shimon Da'asar, Reb Shimon who says that that's not true, Ika lemifrach. The word mifrach from the word pircha, to ask a question. The word parich actually means brittle. It means to shatter a question. He says, Ika lemifrach, I can undo your kal v'chomer. What's the method of undoing a kal v'chomer? Here's the method. The thing which you said was chamor, I'm going to make it not so chamor. You said that chelev has an anush kares, but it also has a kula to it, and this would undo the kal v'chomer. Ma lechelev shekein hutar michlalo eitzel chaya. But chelev has no isser status at all by a chaya, by a small animal, only by large animals. So that's a kula. So maybe we should say your whole kal v'chomer falls apart. Tomar v'gid shelo hutar michlalo eitzel chaya. But when you compare, you wanted to say your kal v'chomer, chelev on the highest level of isser, it's kares. And if that's mutter b'ana, then gid anash, says Reb Shimon, wait a minute. Chelev by a chaya is totally mutter, but the gid anash is still usser. So your kal v'chomer is out the window. A beautiful argument from Rabbi Shimon. It says the Gemara, the idach, how would you explain this? How do you respond to this rejection of your kal v'chomer? What would Rabbi Yossi Aglili respond halfway down? The behema kamrinan, the behema mihas lo ishtrei. You're right that somewhere in the landscape of the world of chelev there's a kula. That's great. By a chaya, we're not talking about a chaya. We're talking about a behema. So by the world of behema, it's anush kares. So I can therefore assume, by definition, that my kal v'chomer is right. Because what you're saying is that there's a kula when it comes to chelev. That's true in another camp of discussion by a smaller animal. I'm talking about a cow. It's a big animal. You're asking me from a chaya? Stop asking me from a chaya. It's a ridiculous question. So that's Rabbi Yossi holds his ground. We're going to end off with this last little piece of the sugya. I'll frame it out first just to make it a little easier to move through, because really, if we were to look back at these two blot and look at every single sugya that we asked on, we asked from sugyas across Shas. Let's see, we asked from Gid Hanoshe, we asked from Dam, we asked from Aver Min Achai, we asked from Shor HaNiskal, we asked from Orla, we asked from the world of Truma, we asked from Nazir, we asked from Chadash, we asked from Shratzim, we asked twice from Chametz. 10 sugyas in Shas. And you know what happens when you go through every sugya? Do you know what the halachic difference in psak would be between Chizkiah and Rabbi Abo? Almost nothing. Limaskana, in conclusion, they agree to almost everything. Where are they different? In their fundamental approach. The word Isser Achila, the word Lo Sochal, that means don't eat it. And Chizkiah says, stop, that's what the word means. No Isser Hana necessarily, unless otherwise noted. And Rabbi Abo is like, no, they're one package deal. But as we've navigated through all of these sugyas, if we were to distill each of these 10, 12 sugyas, the psak seems almost identical across all of them. So that's what the Gemara is asking now. It's at the end of the day, fine, you have a different lumdus, you have a different approach to whether the Isser Hana is tethered to the Isser Achila or are they separate. But in psak, how different are Rabbi Abo and Chizkiah? That's the Gemara's question here, halfway down. Chav Gimel Amud Beis. This will be the last mini sugya that we learned for the night, last aspect of this larger sugya, I should say. Michti, let's see. Osvinhu kohani kroi. You asked from all of these psukim vishaninhu, and you gave me all the answers. Chizkiah v'Rebbe Abo b'mai plige. Where do they argue? Well, we said b'chametz b'pesach ve'aliba derabbanan. They argue in that case. B'shor haniskal ve'aliba dedivrei hakol. Chizkiah nafik lemi lo yochal. V'Rebbe Abo nafik lemi minavela. They learn things out but from different marmikomos. Michti bein lemaru vein lemara surn beno. The halachos are the same. They got different marmikomos. They're learning from different places, but in psak, they're identical. So it asks the Gemara, my benaihu. My gosh, two blot of Gemara. What is the difference between them? So it says the Gemara, only one case of all the 10 that we learned. What is the one case? Ika benaihu, the case of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. In the case of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, here, Rabbi Abo and Chizkiah fundamentally argued even in psak, not just in lumdus, not just in what is the fundamental idea about an Isser Achila? Does it include an Isser Hana or not? Not just there. Even in psak, how did it play out? Chizkiah savar lo yochal lim'ute hani. Also, the word oso lim'ute chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. So Chizkiah held that was a problem. Rabbi Abo savar oso lim'ute hani chulin shenishchatu ba'azara lav d'oraisahu. This is the only place they argue. What happens when there's chulin shenishchatu ba'azara? According to Chizkiah, you still have an Isser Hana. You're not allowed. But according to Rabbi Abo, there is no Isser Hana when it comes to the world of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. So we take the last 2 pages. I'll summarize for you in under 30 seconds. Yeah, here's how it goes. Rabbi Abo and Chizkiah argue fundamentally. When we say you cannot eat something, does it include the Isser Hana? Yes or no? Chizkiah says it does not automatically include it. Rabbi Abo says it does. Okay, we went through 12 cases. They poskin the same in all of them except for one, which is chulin. What happens if you shecht something in the wrong space? It's chulin shenishchatu ba'azar. It's outside of the appropriate mizbeach spot, whatever the parameters are. You did it in the azar, the wrong place. So that's the only time we have a nafkamina and Isser Hana, where Chizkiah is of the opinion that there is an Isser Hana, and Rabbi Abo holds that there isn't. We will stop here and pick up in Mirza Hashem tomorrow with Daf Chav Daled, starting at the bottom of Chav Gimel Amud Beis, about 15 lines or so from the bottom, with Yasifahu Me Rabbanan. Have a beautiful night.